We're going to take a look at a technique called frequency separation. This is commonly used in retouching workflows and involves separating the image into distinct frequency ranges. This is done to allow more efficient retouching, typically making it easier to achieve more realistic results. Rather than having to set the layers up manually, Affinity Photo includes a useful filter to speed the process up. So first, we are going to duplicate the background pixel layer so that we have an original copy of the image to compare our final results with. To do this on Mac, it's Command-J, and on Windows, Control-J. Now with the duplicated layer selected, we can go to Filters and run the Frequency Separation filter here, and we end up with a split preview where you can see the high and low frequency layers. The high frequency layer tends to contain the fine detail or texture of the image, whereas low frequency contains the tone and color information. Moving the radius here will adjust the balance. If we push this too high, you will start to see color information bleeding over onto the high frequency layer, which is typically undesirable. For a standard retouching workflow, the goal would be to find a good balance where you can retouch tone and color information on the low frequency layer, so that might be skin imperfections like tonal inconsistencies, without compromising the integrity of the fine detail or texture, which we would retouch separately on the high frequency layer. You may notice that we have a method option here. This allows us to control the blur method used to create the low frequency layer, and there are some differences here. It defaults to Gaussian, which is okay for general portrait retouching, but it does tend to exaggerate specular highlights and other bright details on the high frequency layer, and you also end up with visible haloing around high contrast edges when you push the radius higher, like here for example. And this could be a disadvantage if you need to do a lot of retouching work on the high frequency detail. Switching across to median actually accentuates the amount of detail attributed to the high frequency layer, and it further flattens out the tonal detail on the low frequency layer, which could be useful if you really need that distinct separation between the two layers. I've done a separate video on how this method is really useful for retouching landscape photography that has lens flare artifacting across the image. So do have a look at that video to see how using median can be really effective. Bilateral will afford us the greatest amount of control over the balance between these two frequency layers. It allows us to use the tolerance slider, which helps to really determine which details end up on these two separate layers. For example, with this portrait image, what we really want to achieve is to have all of the fine detail like the lines and the imperfect skin texture on the high frequency layer. The low frequency layer wants to contain, for the majority, just the tone and color, with very little to no hint of meaningful texture or fine detail. So for this, we will use a radius of near enough 4 pixels and bring the tolerance all the way up to 100%. Once we're happy with the settings, we can click Apply. And now you'll see that our previous background pixel layer that we ran the filter on has been separated into our two frequency layers. We can isolate these layers by Option-clicking on Mac or Alt-clicking on Windows, like so. So I'm actually going to start my work on the low frequency layer in isolation mode, just so I can see more clearly what I'm going to be doing, especially with some of the areas here, like the specular highlights. So first of all, I'm going to use the healing brush tool from the tools panel over here. I'll take the hardness down all the way to 0% for a nice soft-edged brush. And I think I will start over here, just where we have this area of specular highlight on the forehead and nose. So I will increase my brush width using the right square bracket key. Then I want to Option-click on Mac, Alt-click on Windows to sample from an adjacent area, somewhere over here, for example, and then I can just click drag to start healing like so. Now, what's going to be useful for this workflow is unchecking aligned on the context toolbar. So now you'll notice that my sample area has reset to where I initially assigned it. So when aligned is unchecked, every time you let go of the mouse button, that sample area will jump back, which is really useful if you need to do repetitive brush strokes. And so it means that you don't have to constantly reset the sample area. Now, over here, we have this specular area on the eyebrow. So I'm going to sample from an area close by and just brush in. Now, this looks quite strange just on the low frequency layer. So at this point, I'm going to come out of isolation mode just to double check that work. And with the high frequency detail being composited on top, this actually looks satisfactory. Across here, again, just selecting the low frequency layer, we've got the specular shine on the nose here. So I'm just going to sample from an adjacent area just to reduce that slightly. And down here, we've got some specular shine on the lips. We can reduce this as well really quickly. So I can sample from another area of the lip and then just click drag. And every time I let go of the mouse button, that sample area resets. I can do the same for the top lip here. So we're not removing the specular shine entirely. We're just reducing it. While I'm here, I can also fill in this nose shadow. So I'll increase my brush width, sample from this area. And if I brush now, this effect might be too strong. So I will undo using Command Z on Mac, Control Z on Windows. And instead I'll take my brush opacity down. Now, rather than having to go to the context toolbar for this, we can simply use the number keys on our keyboard. So if I want 45% opacity, for example, I can type 45 in quick succession. And now, if I just brush into that area, we've lessened the healing brush effect. Before moving on, don't forget to reset the brush opacity. So to bring it back to 100%, you can use 0. We can also use dodging and burning to control the evenness of tones across the skin. So over here, I can select the dodge brush tool. And again, I'll just increase my brush width. And the effect is quite subtle since we're using a low opacity value here. But when retouching, it is of course very important to make subtle edits. Another tip here, you can go across to the history panel and scrub back using this slider through each history step. So you can actually see the retouching work build up. And that just helps lend us a bit of perspective, especially when we are doing these subtle edits, like using the dodge and burn brush tools. Now, another technique we can employ is to selectively blur areas of the low frequency detail. For example, we might want to do some more work around the nose here. So one easy way to create a nice soft selection is to use quick masking. You can use this option up here or simply just tap Q on the keyboard. Then we can use B for the paintbrush tool. Take our hardness down here, increase the brush width, and across on the color panel, we're already set to white, which will allow us to paint into our selection. So we will just make a selection of the nose detail here where we've got the shadow. Then we can use Q again to come out of quick mask mode. And with an active selection, we can now go to Layer, New Live Filter Layer, Blur, And we can add a live Gaussian blur filter layer. When we add this, it becomes a child layer of the low frequency layer. So the Gaussian blur effect is going to be isolated to just the low frequency detail. We can deselect using Command D on Mac, Control D on Windows. And now, on the live Gaussian blur dialog, I can drag the radius up. And as I do this, notice that it's removing the darker shadow areas. Now we should be careful not to eliminate the lighting depth entirely. So let's just use a more conservative value, like this. Because this is a non-destructive filter layer, this Gaussian blur filter, it means that with the paintbrush tool, we can easily paint on and off its mask. For example, if we wanted to apply the lightening effect to other areas of the face. So because I'm set to white, that means I'm adding to the mask, and I can just paint around the eyes here. I could also go up to the forehead and just smooth that out as well. Again, don't forget that you can isolate masks as well. So if I Option click on Mac or Alt click on Windows on this Gaussian blur filter, we can see the mask in a grayscale representation. So we can see exactly where it's applying, and we can even modify the mask. Once again, let's just click onto another layer to come out of isolation mode. Then I will use H to switch to the View tool. This is another useful little technique. Using H to switch to the View tool means that you can just click drag to pan around your image, and it gets rid of any construction elements that might be showing up if you have a different tool active. For example, with the paintbrush tool, you of course have the brush nozzle present at all times. So switching across to the View tool is a really nice, easy way of just being able to pan around and evaluate your image without accidentally applying any tool you might have selected. Let's evaluate our work so far. I'll just shift click and select both frequency layers, then hide them. So here's the before, this is the original image. And with our work so far just on the low frequency layer, this is the retouching we have achieved. So although there is of course much more work that could be done, which is outside the scope of this video tutorial, you can see how easy it is to retouch tone and color information independent of the texture or fine detail. Let's start work on the high frequency layer now. And for this, we are going to use the clone brush tool. And I'm going to take the hardness all the way up to 100%. This is because we are now working with fine detail and texture. And when we brush, we don't want any soft edge brushwork to start blurring that texture. So I'm going to reduce my brush width. Then once again, Option click on Mac, Alt click on Windows, sample from an adjacent area, and I'm just going to clone over some of the more prominent line detail around the eyes here. Okay, like so, and we can just keep going over the same areas if we feel that the texture lacks some variation or looks repetitive because we've been cloning from these same areas. Across on the nose, we also have this small area, so let's clone that, like so. And we've got a few areas that we could retouch around the other eye here, so let's just tackle the line detail first, like so. And just the areas around the eyelid here. Again, if we're not happy with the first clone result that we get, we can just keep sampling and keep going over the areas until we get a better result. Now, here is an interesting problem. We've got the texture on the skin here. Cloning is going to be really difficult because we don't really have much in the way of any adjacent detail that we can sample from. So instead, let's try this technique. We will add a live clarity filter. Make sure that child layers into the high frequency layer. And then we're going to reduce the strength to a negative value. So to begin with, let's just bring it all the way to -100%. We can always change that later if we need to. Then we will go to Layer and Invert, and that will invert the mask layer for that clarity live filter. Okay, so now the clarity is not being applied to any part of the image. We can get the paintbrush tool. We are already set to white, and now we can just brush in over the chin, like so. So now what we can do is just zoom out slightly, double-click that clarity filter, and just determine what kind of strength value is going to soften that chin textural detail without making it look too unrealistic. Let's stick with -58% for now. But the beauty of having live filter layers is that you can always go in and change that setting later on if you need to. Now, making sure we have the parent high frequency layer selected once again, we can just do some tidy up work here. So I'm going to long click on the healing brush tool to select the in-painting brush tool, and I will take the hardness up to 100%. Then we just have a few areas that we could apply this brush to. So let's just brush over some areas on the lips here. We have this small, very subtle scar that we can get rid of. And also down here, we can just experiment and see if we can tidy up the chin detail slightly as well. Over here, we have some areas on the forehead. And we've also got this hair coming across the face. So let's just use a small brush width and brush over this like so. And then just tackle this hair here too, just to tidy it up. And to finish off, we can also apply sharpening to just the high frequency layer, which provides a more subtle and nuanced sharpening compared to if we just sharpened the entire composite. So again, making sure we have the high frequency layer selected. Let's go to Layer, New Live Filter Layer, Sharpen, Unsharp Mask. We'll use a radius of 1 pixel and try a factor of 2. Okay, this effect is perhaps exaggerated slightly, but let me just show you what happens if we apply that unsharp mask to the entire composite rather than just the high frequency layer. So here we end up exaggerating the high contrast edges. Whereas if I just step back or undo using Command Z on Mac, Control Z on Windows, when we are only sharpening the high frequency detail, the effect is much more refined. Let's take one more look at the before and the after. So here is the before, and now with our retouching work, the after. And there we go, a quick guide on using frequency separation to enhance portraiture retouching. Now, I have only used a few typical retouching techniques to give you an idea of what can be done, but don't forget that you have a roster of retouching tools, including the patch tool and blemish removal tool. And because we've used non-destructive filter effects, you can always go back into these and change the parameters, like with the clarity filter here, or with the Gaussian blur here. I can reevaluate the smoothing of the shadow detail here. Also remember that you can add layers in between your frequency layers. For example, if you wanted to do some non-destructive brightening and darkening of tonal areas, you could add an empty pixel layer above the low frequency layer, select the paintbrush tool, Set this pixel layer's blend mode to overlay. Use a very low opacity, maybe around 5 or 6%, and then brush in with the paintbrush tool. So I'm going to switch across to black here. I can either click here to change to the primary or secondary color, or I can use X on the keyboard. So I'm now painting with pure black. And for example, I could just paint over some areas here. Again, it's very subtle. Let me just show you the before and the after, but it just allows us to take the edge off the brightness of the skin tone around the main area of the face. Anyway, I hope you found this video useful. Thank you for watching.